Two alien girls sent to Earth as punishment, only to fall for the human who rescued them. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get into the story. It all began on a desolate world, far from Earth, where two alien girls were sent to Earth as punishment for defying their empire. They never expected the life-changing encounter with a human who would change everything. Let's return to our main character. Ethan, a mechanic from Earth, never thought a simple day would lead to a life-altering decision. It was a cold, wind-chilled morning when he heard the faint distress signal crackling through his comm system. A signal so faint it almost sounded like static. But Ethan had learned to trust his instincts. With no one else around, he grabbed his gear and made his way toward the source of the signal, deep in the outskirts of the small, rural town where he lived. The landscape was barren, a mixture of old warehouses and deserted factories left behind when industries moved away, leaving nothing but forgotten memories of better days. As Ethan walked through the desolate area, the air was thick with the smell of rust and damp metal. The noise of his boots scraping against the cracked concrete echoed in the empty streets. He reached the location marked on his map, a rundown garage that hadn't seen life in years. The signal was strong now, almost too strong, and it led him to a small, hidden alcove in the back of the building. There, in the shadows, lay two figures. The first, a towering alien woman, with skin like polished jade and piercing yellow eyes. Her body was covered in tattered armor, half melted from the atmosphere she had entered. Beside her, lying in the dirt, was another alien girl. She looked smaller, fragile, her silver blue hair clinging to her face as her body trembled from cold and exhaustion. Ethan's heart raced. He had heard rumors of alien species in the area, but this was something different. These were no ordinary travelers. These were royal figures, two daughters of a powerful empire, stranded on Earth, exiled as punishment for defying their rulers. As Ethan crouched down to assess the situation, his eyes met the alien girl's. Her gaze was full of distrust, anger, and a hint of fear. She was clearly not used to being vulnerable, and Ethan could tell this wasn't a situation they were accustomed to. She looked as if she had been abandoned, left to survive on a world that was not hers. "You're not going to kill us, are you?" the alien girl asked in a raspy voice, her accent strange but understandable, her hand tightening around a small, bladed weapon she had tried to keep hidden. Ethan raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "No, I'm not going to kill you. I just want to help." The girl's eyes narrowed. "Help?" she spat, her voice laced with venom. "Humans are not in the habit of helping those like us. You will want something in return." Ethan shook his head. "I don't want anything in return. Just give me a chance to help. I can get you out of here, get you somewhere safe." She scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "Safe? You think you can save us? We are not just any aliens. We are royalty, and you, a mere human, cannot even begin to comprehend the trouble you're getting into." The second girl, who had been quiet up until now, shifted slightly, her expression softening as she watched Ethan. "She doesn't mean it," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle compared to her companion's harsh tone. "Thank you for offering. But we don't have time to explain. Our lives are in danger." Ethan knelt down beside them, scanning the area for any signs of danger. "What's your name?" he asked. The first girl hesitated before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lyra," she said, her voice thick with pride. "And this is my sister, Serin. We were sent here as punishment, left to die on this desolate world." The truth hit Ethan like a wave. These two weren't just stranded, they were exiled. And whatever empire they came from had abandoned them here, alone, to fend for themselves. As he thought about his options, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to leave them stranded here. Ethan stood up and extended a hand to the pair. "Let me help you, Lyra. Serin, you don't have to be alone." The moment stretched as the two girls exchanged a silent glance. Then, finally, with a reluctant nod, Lyra took his hand. Ethan helped them to their feet, the weight of what was happening sinking in. He had no idea what he was getting into, but one thing was clear: their lives were about to change. and so was his. As Ethan helped Lyra and Serin to their feet, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change his life forever. The weight of their situation was clear. These two were no ordinary aliens, and their empire wasn't something to be taken lightly. Lyra, despite her tough exterior, seemed almost fragile in Ethan's presence. Serin, on the other hand, appeared calmer, her eyes scanning their surroundings as if constantly assessing for threats. The cold wind of the morning whipped through the abandoned factory, but Ethan's mind was focused entirely on the task at hand. They needed shelter, a place to lay low until he could figure out what to do next. "We can't stay here long," Ethan said, glancing around the dim garage. "Come on, follow me." Lyra's eyes flashed with a mixture of distrust and exhaustion, but she nodded silently. They moved quickly through the dark streets, staying close to the shadows as Ethan led them to his rundown apartment on the edge of town. It was small, unremarkable, and safe. At least for now. Inside, Ethan quickly set to work. He pulled out his old first aid kit, patching up the wounds that Lyra and Serin had suffered from their harsh journey. Serin winced as Ethan applied some antiseptic to a cut along her arm. "You should have let us die," Lyra muttered from the corner, her tone cold but not hostile. Ethan looked up from his work, meeting her gaze. "I don't believe in leaving anyone to die, especially not when I can help," he said firmly. Lyra scoffed, but didn't argue. She had no real retort, not with the pain in her face and the vulnerability of being stranded on a foreign world. As he finished with the bandages, Ethan turned to look at Serin, who had been quieter throughout the whole ordeal. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. Serin smiled weakly, nodding her head. "We will survive," she replied, her voice carrying an undeniable strength that contrasted with her frail appearance. Ethan felt a spark of admiration for her. Despite everything, these two had managed to survive a brutal exile. He realized that the situation was far worse than he had imagined. These were not just stranded travelers. They were exiled royals, thrown onto Earth by their own people as punishment. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of empire would abandon its own like this, especially two women who were clearly important. Ethan didn't know much about alien politics, but this felt different. Lyra's eyes never left him as he spoke with Serin, almost as if she were trying to understand him better. "Why are you helping us?" she asked after a long pause. "Is this some kind of trick?" Ethan stopped what he was doing, looking at her with a mixture of confusion and determination. "No trick," he said, his voice steady. "I'm just a guy trying to do the right thing. You've been through enough. I don't care about your empire or what happened to you. I just want to make sure you're safe." Lyra studied him for a long moment before looking away. "You're a fool," she muttered. "We're a burden." Ethan could see the weight of her words, the shame in them. But he wasn't about to let her push him away. "You're not a burden. No one should have to suffer like this. Not when there's a chance to help," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Now get some rest. We'll figure this out together." Lyra said nothing, but Ethan could feel the subtle shift in the air. There was something in her that was beginning to trust him, just a little. Serin, on the other hand, seemed more at ease. She lay down on the makeshift bed Ethan had set up for them, her exhaustion finally catching up with her. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of the city outside. Ethan sat by the window, watching the street below, his mind racing with questions. What kind of trouble were these two really in? And how had their exile come to pass? The thought of helping them seemed simple at first, but the deeper he dug, the more he realized how much more complicated it would become. He couldn't just protect them from the storm outside. He needed to figure out who was after them and why. The sound of Lyra shifting caught his attention. He looked back to find her standing, staring out the window with a distant expression. "You know, humans are strange," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "You give when there is nothing to gain, no reward. It's unsettling." Ethan didn't reply at first, letting her words sink in. She wasn't asking for his sympathy, but he could hear the confusion in her tone. "Maybe that's the difference between us," he said finally. "You've been raised to believe that everything comes with a price. But some things are worth doing just because it's the right thing to do." Lyra turned her head, her sharp eyes locking onto his. For a moment, there was something in her gaze, something softer. Then she looked away, her jaw tightening. "I don't know if I can ever repay you for this," she said, her voice steady now. Ethan smiled slightly. "You don't have to. Just stay safe." With that, The room fell silent once again, the weight of their shared situation settling between them. The storm outside had passed, but the real storm, what lay ahead for all of them, had just begun. The morning after, Ethan awoke to the faint sound of movement in the small apartment. He stretched, feeling the wear of the previous day's events on his body, and rubbed his eyes as he sat up. The apartment was still, except for the soft rustle of the blankets where Serin lay. Lyra was nowhere to be seen. Ethan stood, his bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and made his way to the small kitchen area, where he started to prepare some food for the three of them. He didn't have much, just canned beans and some old bread, but it would have to do. As he worked, he thought about the night before. Lyra's words lingered in his mind. Some things are worth doing just because it's the right thing to do. He wasn't sure why, but he could feel that there was more to her than the hard exterior she projected. She'd been through something, and it had left scars deeper than he could understand. A sudden sound behind him broke his train of thought. He turned to find Lyra standing in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes hard, yet tired. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low. Ethan didn't answer immediately, just nodded and motioned for her to sit at the small table. She hesitated, but then moved to the chair, sitting down slowly, her gaze never leaving him. "You're putting yourself in danger by helping us," she said, her voice steady, though there was a quiet desperation underneath. "The Empire does not take betrayal lightly, and you've already done much more than anyone else would. I don't want to see you dragged into this." Ethan set the spoon down and leaned against the counter, studying her for a moment. "I'm not afraid," he said simply. "You're not the first people I've helped, and you won't be the last." Lyra didn't seem to know how to respond to that, her gaze softening for just a moment before she hardened it again. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," she muttered, almost to herself. Ethan stepped closer, his voice calm. "Then tell me. Help me understand." The silence that followed was thick with tension. For a moment, Lyra seemed to be fighting with herself, torn between her instinct to push him away and the truth she knew she couldn't keep hidden any longer. Finally, she spoke. "We're not just runaways. We're the daughters of the Tan Dominion's royal family, and we were sent here as punishment, not just for defying our empire, but for something far worse." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had suspected that they were more than just ordinary aliens, but this was different. He had no idea what kind of power the Tan Dominion wielded, but something told him this was much bigger than what he had imagined. Lyra's eyes flickered to Serin, who had just entered the room, looking pale and tired. She seemed to sense the change in the air as well. "They'll come for us," Lyra continued, her voice more steady now, but laced with the same fear. "And when they do, they'll do anything to ensure we never make it back. The punishment for failing the Empire is death, but the real punishment is being forgotten, left to rot on a world like this, with no hope of ever returning." Ethan's mind raced as the weight of her words settled in. He had assumed they were being chased by bounty hunters or some rogue faction, but this was different. This was political. This was personal. "How can I help you then?" he asked, his voice firm. "You don't need to do anything," Lyra said quickly, her eyes flashing. "You've already done more than anyone could have expected." Serin moved to sit beside Ethan, her voice gentle. "What Lyra means is that we can't drag you into our problems. We're beyond saving." Ethan shook his head, looking at both of them. "No, that's not how this works. You don't get to decide that. I'm in this now. If you're going to run, I'm coming with you." The determination in his voice was clear. He wasn't backing down. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It was Lyra who finally broke the silence, her voice quieter now. "You're a fool," she said, but there was no malice in her tone. Instead, there was something else, something softer. "But maybe a fool is what we need." Ethan smiled slightly, relieved to see the wall between them start to crack, even if just a little. "Then let's get moving," he said. "We've got work to do." Lyra looked at him, a flicker of something in her eyes, but she didn't say anything more. Instead, she nodded once, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since they had arrived. "We'll need to find supplies. We can't stay here much longer." Ethan nodded, already thinking ahead. "I've got a few contacts who can help. We'll figure this out together." As they prepared to leave, Ethan couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The weight of the journey ahead pressed down on him, but he knew one thing for certain. They would survive, and they would fight. And no matter what, Ethan wasn't going to let them face it alone. The next morning, Ethan, Lyra, and Serin were ready to leave the apartment. They gathered their things quietly, each lost in their own thoughts, knowing that the path ahead would be anything but easy. Ethan had made arrangements with a few contacts in the underground network, people who could help them get supplies, but it wasn't going to be enough. They needed a plan, a real escape plan. Lyra moved towards the small window and peered outside, her expression unreadable as she watched the city wake up. The skyline was distant, but Ethan could see the worry in her posture. "They'll be watching soon," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You have no idea what kind of power they have. The Tan Dominion doesn't forget." Ethan nodded but didn't say anything. He wasn't afraid. He knew they were in danger, but he wasn't about to back down. He turned to Serin, who had been quiet all morning. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, his voice soft. Serin smiled at him, her eyes softening. "I'll be fine. We'll get through this. We always do." Ethan wasn't so sure, but he didn't push. He knew they were both struggling with their situation, trying to stay strong for the other. They packed quickly, moving as quietly as possible. The streets outside were busier than usual, and Ethan didn't want to draw attention to them. They needed to get to the safe house as soon as possible. As they stepped out of the apartment, Lyra took a deep breath, scanning the street for any signs of danger. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice urgent. "The longer we stay in one place, the more likely they are to find us." Ethan led the way, taking them down side streets and alleyways, trying to avoid the main roads. The sun was rising, and the air felt heavy with anticipation, like something was about to happen. Ethan's mind raced with plans and contingencies, trying to keep them safe. They arrived at a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of town. It was exactly the kind of place Ethan had been hoping for, low profile, isolated, and secure. He knocked on the door twice, waiting. After a moment, the door opened slightly, and a man with a scruffy beard and a wary look in his eyes appeared. "Ethan?" he asked, recognizing him immediately. Ethan nodded. "We need your help," he said quietly. "We're being hunted." The man stepped back, motioning them inside. "Come in, quick." As they entered the building, the man closed the door behind them and led them down a narrow hallway. "This way," he muttered. Ethan followed, glancing back at Lyra and Serin. They were both tense, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The man stopped in front of a door and opened it, revealing a small, dimly lit room with a few cots and an old table. "You can stay here for now," he said. "But you'll need to move quickly once we get you what you need." Ethan nodded, his mind already working out the next steps. "Thank you," he said. "We just need a few things, supplies, and somewhere we can lay low until we figure out our next move." The man nodded again, then turned to leave. "I'll be back with your supplies in a few hours. Stay quiet, stay out of sight. The less attention you draw, the better." Ethan looked at the two girls as the door closed behind the man. They were exhausted, but they couldn't rest for long. They needed to be ready to move again as soon as they could. Lyra, however, seemed to be struggling with something. She stood by the window, her gaze distant. Ethan walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You all right?" he asked. She didn't turn to look at him at first, but then she slowly nodded. "Just thinking," she replied softly. "About what's waiting for us. About what we've left behind." Ethan didn't push her. He understood. They had all been through so much. She had been exiled, cast aside by her own people, and now she was stuck on a planet that wasn't her own, trying to figure out a way to survive. Serin walked over to join them, her eyes soft but steady. "We'll make it," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "We have to. Together." Ethan smiled at her, feeling a sense of gratitude for her optimism. "Yeah," he said, his voice firm. "Together." For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of distant traffic and the occasional bird chirping outside. They were safe for now, but the storm was coming. They could feel it. Ethan knew that they couldn't stay here forever, but at least for today, they had a chance to breathe. And that was all he could ask for. As the sun rose higher in the sky, they sat in the small room, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The future was uncertain, and danger loomed on the horizon, but for the first time in a long while, they had each other. And that was enough. For now. Hours passed in the dimly lit room as Ethan, Lyra, and Serin sat in tense silence. The man who had promised to help them had not yet returned with the supplies, and Ethan's mind raced with scenarios. How long could they stay hidden? How long until the Tan Dominion discovered their whereabouts, and what they would do once they were found? Lyra paced back and forth near the window, her eyes flicking to the street below as she scanned for any signs of trouble. Serin, however, had settled onto one of the cots, her head resting against the wall as she tried to sleep. Ethan couldn't help but notice how worn both girls looked, the weight of their exile heavy on their shoulders. He, too, felt the pressure, but he refused to show it. They couldn't afford to crack, not now. Just then, the door creaked open, and the man they had met earlier entered, holding a bag filled with supplies. He looked over his shoulder nervously before closing the door behind him. "I've got what you need," he said in a low voice, placing the bag on the table. "But we don't have much time. I suggest you leave as soon as you can. There are whispers. People are starting to notice unusual activity around here." Ethan nodded, moving quickly to the table to inspect the supplies. It wasn't much, some food, water, and a few med kits, but it would be enough for now. He turned to Lyra and Serin, who had both gathered around him. "We need to be ready to move fast. Once we have everything packed, we leave." Lyra glanced at the man with suspicion. "What's the catch? Why are you helping us?" The man's eyes flickered, but he didn't hesitate before answering. "No catch. I don't care about your politics or your empire. I just don't want anyone else getting hurt because of a bad decision I made." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "A bad decision?" The man shrugged. "I used to work for the Dominion. I know how they operate. I wasn't a part of the inner circle, but I've seen enough to know what happens when someone crosses them. I don't want to be caught in the crossfire." Ethan could feel the tension in the room thicken. The man wasn't lying. There was something about his demeanor. He wasn't the type to get involved unless he had a good reason. "Thank you," Ethan said after a long pause. "We owe you." The man shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. Just get out of here, while you still can." Ethan packed the supplies quickly, and with one last look around the room, he motioned for the girls to follow him. "Let's move." As they stepped out into the narrow hallway, the man gave them one last piece of advice. "Don't trust anyone," he said, his voice grave. "The Tan Dominion has eyes everywhere. You'll be safer if you stick to the shadows." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He knew they were already walking a fine line, but with the stakes as high as they were, caution was their only option. They made their way through the back alleys, avoiding the main roads, with Ethan leading the way. Lyra and Serin followed closely behind, both alert but quiet, their eyes scanning the area around them. As they reached the edge of town, the weight of what they were doing began to hit home. They weren't just escaping. They were running from an empire that would stop at nothing to find them. They had no idea where they were going, only that they couldn't stay here any longer. The safe house had been their only option for now, but Ethan knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. "We need to get off this planet," he muttered under his breath, glancing back at the girls. Lyra's voice cut through the silence. "You think we can? There's no place we can go that the Dominion won't find us." Ethan looked at her, his expression determined. "There's always a way. We just have to find it." Serin, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke. Maybe we can find a ship, a place far enough from here." Ethan looked at her, her words giving him a glimmer of hope. "It's a start. Let's keep moving." As they continued through the back streets, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he instinctively quickened his pace. Lyra and Serin noticed the change in his demeanor, but said nothing. They, too, could feel it. The sense of danger was palpable. They reached a small, run-down warehouse at the outskirts of town, a place Ethan knew could provide some temporary shelter. He pushed open the door cautiously and motioned for the girls to follow. Inside, it was dark and empty, the scent of old wood and metal filling the air. The dim light from outside barely filtered in through the cracks in the walls. It wasn't ideal, but it would do. Ethan closed the door behind them, sealing them inside for the time being. He turned to face Lyra and Serin, his voice steady but urgent. "We wait here for now. We'll figure out our next move when it's safe." Lyra nodded, but there was a doubt in her eyes. "Safe? We're never safe. Not as long as they're looking for us." Ethan walked over to the far corner of the warehouse and sat down, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He knew Lyra was right. They were never truly safe. Not while the Dominion was after them. But he wasn't going to give up. Not yet. He looked at Serin, who who was sitting next to Lyra, both of them tired and unsure of what lay ahead. "We'll find a way," he said, his voice firm. "We'll survive this." For the first time in days, the three of them sat together in silence, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the hours dragged on inside the dark warehouse, Ethan, Lyra, and Serin remained motionless, their senses heightened to every sound in the otherwise quiet room. The silence between them was heavy, each person lost in their own thoughts about what the next step would be. Ethan glanced out the cracked window, the light from the outside casting faint shadows on the cold concrete floor. They couldn't stay here long. The longer they did, the greater the risk. Lyra broke the silence, her voice low but sharp. "How long do you think we can hide in this place?" she asked, her gaze flickering towards Ethan. "We need to get off the planet, Ethan. The Dominion's reach is endless. We can't outrun them forever." Ethan didn't reply immediately. He knew she was right, but there had to be a way. There always was. He turned away from the window and walked towards the far corner of the room, where a stack of old crates sat. "We'll need a ship," he said, finally meeting Lyra's eyes. "I know a few people who can help us get one. It won't be easy, but it's our best shot." Serin, who had been quietly observing the conversation, now spoke up. Her voice was calm but steady. "And what happens when they find us? What happens to you? To everyone who helps us?" There was a subtle, unspoken fear in her words, and Ethan could see the strain it was placing on her. She was trying to stay strong, but the pressure was clearly taking its toll. Ethan stepped closer to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll deal with that when it comes," he said, his voice firm. "For now, our only focus is getting out of here. Together." Lyra crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "You talk about together, but do you even know what that means for us? You think you can help us, but the truth is, we were never meant to be saved. We were meant to be examples, warnings. If you try to help us, you'll just end up like everyone else, dragged down by the Empire." Ethan's face remained neutral, but inside, a fire burned. He wasn't about to let the Dominion win, not when he had the chance to do something. "I'm not leaving anyone behind," he said, his tone unwavering. "Not you, not anyone." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, the hardness in her gaze slowly beginning to crack. "You really think you can save us?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "From them?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." For the first time, there was a flicker of something in Lyra's eyes, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, buried deep beneath the anger and fear that had dominated her since their arrival on Earth. She didn't respond, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, a slight softening. The air was thick with tension, but it was different now. There was a sense of resolve in the room, as if something had changed. They weren't just trying to survive anymore. They were fighting for something, for each other. The sound of footsteps from outside the warehouse cut through the quiet, sharp and deliberate. Ethan's senses went on high alert immediately. He motioned for the girls to stay quiet, and quickly moved to the back of the room. Lyra and Serin followed, their movements swift and silent. They had to remain hidden. Ethan's heart raced as he crouched by a stack of crates, listening intently. The footsteps grew louder, and then there was a pause, followed by the sound of a door creaking open. Ethan didn't dare move. A muffled voice echoed through the room, but it was too faint to make out. The figure outside was moving cautiously, not wanting to make noise, but Ethan could tell they were close. The tension in the air was thick, every second feeling like an eternity. Lyra and Serin stood motionless behind him, waiting for his signal. Then, as quickly as the footsteps had appeared, they stopped. The door was closed, and silence returned. Ethan let out a quiet breath, tension leaving his shoulders as he slowly stood. "I think we've been lucky this time," he whispered, turning to face the girls. "But we need to move, now." Without another word, they gathered their things, slipping out the back door of the warehouse into the quiet street outside. Ethan led the way, his mind sharp, every sense on high alert. They couldn't afford to be caught. The city was vast, but the Empire's reach was even greater. As they walked, Ethan kept his head down, trying to blend in with the shadows. Lyra and Serin followed closely behind, their eyes constantly scanning for danger. They made their way through the back streets, avoiding the main roads. Ethan didn't know where they were going, only that they couldn't stay in the city much longer. He was starting to feel the weight of the situation settle in. Time was running out. They needed to leave Earth, and fast. It wasn't just the Dominion they were running from anymore. It was everything that had brought them to this point. Every step felt like it was leading them closer to an uncertain future, but Ethan wouldn't let fear control him. They had come this far together, and they weren't stopping now. "We'll find a way," Ethan muttered to himself as much as to the girls. Lyra glanced up at him, the uncertainty in her eyes still present, but softened by his words. "Yeah," she said, her voice quieter now. "We will." For the first time since they had met, there was a flicker of something more than just survival in her eyes. A glimmer of hope. And that was enough. The night was colder than Ethan expected as they made their way through the quiet streets, moving quickly but cautiously. The city was still alive, but the danger they were facing kept them in the shadows, avoiding the main roads and sticking to alleyways. The soft hum of distant traffic was the only sound, broken occasionally by the soft crunch of their footsteps on the uneven pavement. Lyra and Serin kept close, their faces set in determination, but there was a quiet tension between them. They had been running for days now, and though they had managed to avoid detection so far, Ethan knew they couldn't keep this up forever. "We're getting close," Ethan whispered as he glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was following them. They had been through several twists and turns, always checking behind them, but for the moment, they were alone. Lyra nodded without saying anything, her sharp eyes constantly scanning the area around them. She had become more reserved as the days passed, her once fiery demeanor now tempered by exhaustion and the weight of their situation. Ethan could sense it. The walls she had built around herself were getting thicker, but he understood. The Empire had broken her trust long ago. Serin, on the other hand, was still quiet, her soft voice only heard when she spoke directly to Ethan or Lyra. But even she was on edge, her usual calm demeanor replaced with a quiet urgency. They had reached a small, seemingly abandoned building, tucked away between two larger structures. The windows were dark, the door cracked open just enough to indicate that it had been used recently. Ethan motioned for the girls to stay behind him as he approached, his hand on the worn doorknob. He paused, feeling the weight of the moment. They were close now, but they weren't out of danger yet. They could hear nothing from inside, and that unsettled him. Slowly, he pushed the door open, peering into the dark interior. The place seemed empty, with only the faintest light coming from a small, flickering lamp in the corner. "Stay quiet," he whispered, moving into the building first. Lyra and Serin followed closely behind, their footsteps almost silent as they entered the dimly lit room. Ethan's eyes adjusted quickly to the low light, scanning the space for any signs of danger. The room was small but appeared to be some sort of storage area. Empty crates, old boxes, and piles of discarded materials scattered across the floor. It looked abandoned, but there was something off about it. The air felt too still. "This doesn't feel right," Lyra muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's too quiet." Ethan nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife he carried, ready for anything. He moved cautiously toward the back of the room, checking every corner, his senses on high alert. As he reached the far wall, his eyes flickered toward a door on the opposite side of the room. The door was cracked open slightly, just enough to reveal a sliver of light from the other side. "We're not alone," he muttered under his breath, looking back at the girls. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Lyra shook her head, her jaw tight. "I'm not staying behind," she said, her tone firm. Serin stood by her, her eyes narrowed with determination. "We're in this together," she added softly. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded, understanding their resolve. "Fine, but stay close. And keep quiet." The three of them moved toward the door, their steps light but deliberate. Ethan reached out, slowly pushing it open. The light from the other rooms spilled into the dark space, revealing a narrow hallway lined with old pipes and exposed wiring. At the far end of the hallway, a faint noise echoed, a low hum, almost like a machine running. They moved forward, their eyes locked on the dark corridor ahead. The noise grew louder as they approached, and Ethan's heart began to race. He didn't know what to expect, but the sense of danger was undeniable. They reached the end of the hallway, where a large metal door stood ajar. Ethan took a deep breath before pushing it open, his grip tightening on his weapon. The room inside was larger than he expected, filled with equipment he didn't recognize. The hum was coming from a massive machine in the center of the room, its lights blinking in a strange pattern. The walls were lined with monitors, most of them dark, but a few still flickered with static. And in the far corner of the room, there were people. 2 men, standing by a desk, talking in low voices. Ethan froze, his heart pounding. They hadn't been detected yet, but it was only a matter of time. He motioned for the girls to stay back and slowly crept closer, trying to get a better look. He could hear the men talking, but the words were muffled. "Do you think they'll find them soon?" one of them asked. "I'm not sure," the other replied. "But we can't risk waiting much longer." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. They were talking about him, about Lyra and Serin. They knew where they were. "They're already looking for us," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Lyra's eyes flashed with fury, but she stayed silent, her fists clenched at her sides. Serin's expression remained calm, but her eyes were wide with the weight of the situation. Ethan's mind raced. They had to leave. Now. He turned to face the girls, his voice low but urgent. "We need to move, right now. Get to the back door, and don't stop until we're out of sight." They turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind them with a loud bang, echoing through the room. The men had heard them. Ethan's pulse quickened as he glanced back at Lyra and Serin, his mind calculating their next move. There was no turning back now. They had to fight their way out. The moment of escape had passed, and now, it was a battle for survival. The door slammed shut behind them with a loud, resonating bang, and for a split second, Ethan felt his heart stop. The men had heard them. There was no more time for hesitation, no more time for strategy. It was now or never. Ethan spun on his heels, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room for any escape route. He motioned for Lyra and Serin to follow him, his mind racing with every possible scenario. "Move now," he hissed urgently. They darted toward the back of the room, but the men were already closing in. One of them reached for a communication device on the desk, his eyes locking onto Ethan. "We've got them," he muttered into the receiver, and Ethan's blood ran cold. No time to waste. Lyra's eyes flared with anger, but Ethan shook his head, signaling for her to hold back. This wasn't the time for a fight. They needed to escape. They reached the back door just as the sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing down the hallway. Ethan pushed the door open, his hand shaking slightly as he felt the cold air hit his face. They were out of the building, but it wouldn't be long before the entire area was swarming with the Dominion's forces. Lyra, who had been walking silently beside him, looked over at him with a mixture of frustration and resolve. "Where do we go now?" she asked, her voice tight. "I don't know, but we can't stay here," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. He scanned the area around them, his mind already working through their next move. The streets were quiet, too quiet. He could hear distant voices, the low hum of hover vehicles in the air, but the place seemed deserted. "There's a safe house a few miles from here," Ethan said. "It's a long shot, but it's the best option we've got." "A few miles?" Serin asked, glancing around. "How will we get there without being seen?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, considering their options. The streets were wide open, and there was no way they could avoid being spotted by the Dominion's surveillance systems if they stayed exposed for too long. He spotted a narrow alleyway a few blocks ahead. "We'll move through the alleyways, stay off the main streets," he said. "We'll take it slow and stay low. Keep your heads down." They hurried toward the alley, trying to keep to the shadows. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as his thoughts raced, but he kept his focus. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The alley was dark, the walls covered with graffiti and layers of grime. The faint smell of garbage filled the air as they moved swiftly through the narrow space. It was cramped, but at least it was concealed from the watchful eyes of the city. They turned a corner, and Ethan froze, holding up his hand to signal the others to stop. The street ahead was blocked by 2 Dominion soldiers, their backs turned as they spoke to each other. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. They were trapped. He quickly gestured to Lyra and Serin to stay low, pressing his back against the cold brick wall. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears as he watched the soldiers in the distance. They had no choice but to wait. For what felt like an eternity, they remained still, barely breathing, waiting for the soldiers to move on. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the 2 soldiers turned and walked down the street, their voices growing fainter as they disappeared into the distance. Ethan let out a quiet breath of relief, his muscles aching from the tension. We can't keep doing this. Lyra whispered, her voice barely audible. We have to find a way off this planet. Ethan nodded, his mind already working on their next move. They couldn't keep hiding forever. We will, he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his chest. But we need to keep moving. The longer we stay in one place, the more dangerous it gets. They continued down the alley, moving swiftly but cautiously. Ethan kept his eyes scanning their surroundings, listening for any signs of danger. The safe house wasn't far now, but he knew they had to be careful. They reached another street, and Ethan motioned for them to follow him across. The alley opened up to a narrow side street, and from there, they could cut through an abandoned industrial zone. It was quieter here, the buildings dilapidated and crumbling, with long-forgotten remnants of the city's former industry scattered across the area. The path was treacherous, but it was the safest route they had. As they moved further into the abandoned area, the sounds of the city grew distant, replaced by the eerie silence of a forgotten part of town. The only sound was the crunch of their footsteps on broken glass and gravel. They had been walking for what felt like hours when Ethan finally saw the safe house up ahead. It was a nondescript building, tucked away between two larger structures. The front door was slightly ajar, and Ethan quickly motioned for the others to follow him inside. The inside was dimly lit, with old furniture scattered around and the faint scent of mildew in the air. There were no windows, no visible signs of life. Ethan let out a quiet breath of relief. We're safe for now, he whispered. Lyra, though, didn't seem convinced. For now, she muttered, looking around with suspicion. How long before they find us here? Ethan glanced at her, his expression hardening. I don't know, but we'll be ready. We have to be. The door creaked behind them, and Ethan turned quickly, ready for whatever might come next. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, they weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. The door creaked shut behind them, and the heavy silence of the safe house settled in. Ethan, Lyra, and Serin stood in the dimly lit room, each lost in their thoughts. The last few days had taken their toll. The weight of their escape, the constant threat of the Dominion, the uncertainty of what lay ahead, it all hung in the air like a heavy fog. Ethan moved across the room, his footsteps soft against the floor, and sat at the small table in the corner. He needed to think. They needed a plan, a way off this planet, away from the eyes of the Dominion. Lyra was standing by the window, looking out at the darkened street below. Her eyes were distant, haunted. How long do you think we can keep running? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked up at her, his gaze steady. As long as it takes, he said. We don't have much time. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it gets. But we'll figure it out. We always do. Serin, who had been sitting quietly at the table, spoke up. We need to find a way to contact someone. There's got to be someone who can help us get off this planet. Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. He knew they were running out of time. The Dominion would stop at nothing to track them down. I know a guy, he said, standing up. He's got connections. But it's risky. We'll need to be careful. Lyra turned away from the window, her eyes narrowing. Who is he? She asked, suspicion in her voice. Someone I trust. Ethan said, though even as he said it, doubt lingered in his mind. There was no such thing as trust in a world like this, not when it came to the Dominion. He didn't know if the man he was thinking of could be trusted, but right now, they had no other options. Lyra didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned to Serin. We don't have a choice. We need to take the risk. Serin nodded. I agree. We can't stay here forever. Ethan could see the tension in their faces, the uncertainty about what was to come, but there was also determination. They were all in this together. All right, Ethan said, his voice steady. We'll leave in the morning. Stay low, stay quiet. We don't know who's watching, but we'll figure it out. As the night wore on, the three of them sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The weight of their situation pressing down on them. Ethan couldn't help but think of everything they had been through to get here, everything they had sacrificed. He had never thought he'd be caught up in something like this, never thought he'd be running from an empire, but now that he was here, he wasn't going to back down. Not for himself, and not for Lyra and Serin. The next morning came too quickly, and as the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls, Ethan stood up and moved toward the door. Let's go, he said, his voice low but firm. Lyra and Serin followed, their faces set with resolve. They knew what they were risking, but they had no other choice. The road ahead would be dangerous, filled with uncertainty, but it was the only road they could take. As they stepped outside into the early morning light, Ethan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. They had a plan, but plans often didn't survive the first contact with reality. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let the Dominion win. He wasn't going to let them take everything from him, from Lyra, from Serin. Not without a fight. The three of them moved through the quiet streets, their steps quick but cautious, always aware of their surroundings. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every passing vehicle a potential danger. But they kept moving, determined to reach their goal. As they approached the meeting point, Ethan's heart began to race. He wasn't sure if this was the right move, if they could really trust the man they were going to meet, but it was their only shot. They reached the corner where they were supposed to meet him, and Ethan looked around, scanning the area for any signs of trouble. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a figure stepped out from the shadows. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and his face was partially obscured by the collar. He didn't look like much, but Ethan could sense the tension in the air. This was the contact he had been hoping for. "You're late," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady. "We had to be careful. We've been running for days." The man nodded, his eyes flickering, toward Lyra and Serin. "I know who you are. I know what you're running from." Ethan's heart sank. "Can you help us or not?" The man studied him for a moment before nodding. "I can get you out of here, but it won't be easy. There are risks, and there are no guarantees." Ethan took a deep breath. "We'll take the risk." The man nodded again and turned, motioning for them to follow. "Follow me," he said, leading them into the shadows. As they moved deeper into the alley, Ethan couldn't help but wonder if they were walking into another trap, but he didn't have a choice. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to stop now. They followed the man, their footsteps echoing in the quiet morning, not knowing what the next chapter of their journey would bring. But one thing was certain. They were still alive, and as long as they were, they would keep fighting. Together.